Is a new world order coming? Globalization as we know it has reached its tipping point, just as China is committing to further opening up. The United States, the world's only superpower, has taken a protectionist turn.
From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.
So, the question is, what's next? What's next when low growth meets rising expectations in developed countries? What's next when the world turns multipolar as developing countries grow? What's next when existing institutions fail to adapt? All these questions are addressed in a new wave of globalization. This week, we look at Globalization 4.0 to be closer to China. On November 5th to 10th, the second China International Import Expo, exemplifying China's commitment to further open up its huge domestic market to global merchants and investors, was held in Shanghai. In his opening address, President Xi Jinping affirmed that China's development benefits the world, not threatens it. He said the expo is aimed at reducing China's trade imbalances and satisfying the Chinese people's demand for a better life with the world's most advanced products. He pledged China will adopt 5 measures to promote higher-level opening up, expand markets, improve framework, optimize business environment, deepen cooperation, and jointly build the Belt and Road, thus providing other countries with more opportunities of market, investment, and growth. He said China will ease market access for foreign investment, shorten the negative list, and make the business environment more market-oriented, law-based, and internationalized. He called for a new kind of open world economy, one that is cooperative, innovative, and sharing. What constitutes China's further opening up? How important is it for China's development and for its relations with the world? And as China opens into globalization, why are some countries closing into protectionism? What's the purpose of a new round of globalization? To explore China's further opening up is to be closer to China. Europe, a continent of developed nations, many of them among the world's richest. But on the continent, 1 in 4 citizens does not live well, earning around 60% of the national average.
Ireland was hit very hardly by the crisis, with the house bubble, let me say. Portugal was also very hardly hit and was also under an assistance program. And Italy has, since a long time, we can see that there are structural problems.
Many people in Europe are without jobs. One such young man is Tancredi Euphrates. He is searching for work while still living with his parents. He graduated from high school 2 years ago, and ever since he has remained unemployed. His father, a social worker, has been unemployed for 2 years. His sister is also unemployed, and she has a child.
In cui si sta vivendo un cambiamento che non è solo legato al lavoro, è un cambiamento secondo me proprio di modo di vedere la vita, è un cambiamento più interiore dell'essere umano, soprattutto in Italia da noi, e quindi questo cambiamento sta incidendo moltissimo poi su tutto quello che c'è intorno.
In Italy, the unemployment rate has reached as high as 10%, with half of them being young people. As of June 2019, the unemployment rate in the Eurozone reached 7.5%. It is the middle class whose standard of living is being eroded by falling wages and rising costs, the product, they say, of globalization. On October 15th, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, lowered its global growth forecast for 2019 to 3%, down 0.2% from its estimates in July. The report shows developed economies continuing to slow, with growth downgraded to 1.7% in 2019, compared to 2.3% in 2018. Globalization, the buzzword for the past 2 decades, now seems challenged by uncertainty and fear. To get a closer look at globalization, we interview Professor Chen Wenling, Chief Economist of the China Center for International Economic Exchanges, Professor Zheng Yongnien, Director of the East Asian Institute, National University of Singapore, Rosen Asenev-Plevneliev, former President of Bulgaria, Kishore Mahbubani, Distinguished Fellow of the Asia Research Institute, National University of Singapore, Martin Jock, Senior Fellow in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Cambridge. In recent years, the international situation has changed. Unilateralism and protectionism have increasingly affected the international economic order, and the risks and uncertainties facing the global economy have risen. What causes these changes in the world economic situation?
There are two sources contributing to the uncertainties of the global economy. First, and while it may sound a bit absurd, the decades of fast growth with rapid accumulation of wealth started the globalization in the 1980s. The trouble with that is it also brought about a yawning income gap and divided societies within all countries. That disparity leads to economic populism and trade protectionism, particularly in the U.S. Second is geopolitics. Simply put, when a state puts their so-called national security above economic development, its economic growth will be affected by geopolitics. Today, we are confronting such a scenario. So, first, rapid growth, economic globalization, triggers the issues of globalization itself, leading to divided societies. And second, changing geopolitics contributes to an uncertain international environment affecting the economic growth of all countries, including the U.S., China, and also smaller countries, such as Singapore.
Since the turn of the 21st century, China's economy has grown at high speed and has become a prime engine driving the world economy. But today, given China's domestic economic problems, combined with the ever-changing world economic environment, what is the current condition of China's economy?
Before 2008, the U.S. was the largest engine of global economic growth. Over the past 40 years, since China established diplomatic ties with the U.S. contributed to an average annual growth rate of 22.4% to the global economy, and China 19.6%. But we have seen a turning point. After the global financial crisis in 2008, China replaced the U.S. as the stronger economic engine. In the year 2008, China generated over 30% of the global economy, while the U.S. lowered to 13%, less than half of China's contribution. That is why China's growth has bearing on the global economic growth. The Sino-U.S. trade war affects not only China and the U.S., but also the rest of the world. Against that backdrop, China's economy faces increasing downward pressure. The 2019 GDP growth rate was 6.4% for the first quarter, 6.2% for the second quarter, and 6% for the third quarter.
China indeed faces downward economic pressure, but also with broad growth potential. Not one single worldwide economy wants to stay away from the Chinese market. The middle class in China takes a smaller portion compared to that of the U.S. Its absolute scale has already surpassed that of the U.S. and keeps growing, which is not the case for the U.S. For China to further grow, it must join the new round of globalization.
Coming up next, if globalization is failing, could nationalism be the key to energize the sluggish global economy? Do sovereign states have other options? All these and more next on Closer to China. Although faced with similar downward economic pressure, the Chinese government argues that sluggish economies are not due to globalization, but to a lack of global governance architecture. From the discovery of America in 1492 to the rise of the British Empire in the 17th century, human civilization has moved from seclusion to openness, from isolation to integration. After World War II, the international community came together to build a shared future, introducing the third wave of globalization. There have always been challenges. In an article published in January 2019, The Economist summarized the new trend of globalization. Titled Slowballization, the steam has gone out of globalization, the author states, globalization made the world a better place for almost everyone, but too little was done to mitigate its costs. The integrated world's neglected problems have now grown in the eyes of the public to the point where the benefits of the global order are easily forgotten. China states that threats to globalization call for a new era of globalization, a globalization where new global governance architecture must take precedence. An article in The Economist stated that economic globalization has lost momentum, using slowballization to describe the current state of the world economy. There are even extreme claims that globalization is dead. How should these two assertions be assessed?
One, the old Western-shaped globalization between 1980 and 2016 is no longer fit for purpose. It's dead, basically. It's dead. And it can't be resurrected in the old form. Secondly, that China's embarking on its own mode of globalization, which is very distinctive from that neoliberal period, Western neoliberal period.
Now, 88% of the world's population lives outside the West, and the last 30 years of human history have been very good for the remaining 88% of the world. And the major countries, China, ASEAN, even India to some extent, Japan, South Korea, they're not deglobalizing. In fact, they're globalizing even more. So when the Economist talks about deglobalization, it's talking about the populist sentiments in Western societies. And the problem is that this populism sentiments has been caused by the elites in America and Europe who have failed to take care of the bottom 50% in their own population.
Though there are signs of the emergence of counter-globalization, globalization is still the dominant trend. Today, what are the new and most prominent features of this new round of economic globalization?
It's the greatest thing that happened during the globalization, which started in 1980 and finished, in my view, around about 2016, was the entry of a lot more countries, obviously in the developing world, especially China, into economic growth, the global trading network, the rise of Chinese exports, and so on. This was extremely important.
Compared with the previous 3 rounds of economic globalization, what is the biggest difference in this new round?
First is the establishment of economic ties between manufacturing, trade and service industry. It is triggered by a new round of scientific and technological revolution that is ever more closely linked during the 4th round of economic globalization. China, the US and all countries in the global community have a stake in each other. We are bound together for good or bad. That is why we say the global economy is like a colossal ship that no single country can navigate it on its own. Second, the current new round of economic globalization has seen tremendous changes of the economic forms. Globalization in the past focused on the connections of the real economies. Today, the global economic form is composed of both the real economy and the virtual economy. That is the modern economic form. In other words, the modern economic form is driven by 2 wheels, the real economy and the virtual economy. Third, the methods of economic connections have shifted remarkably. In the past, enterprises made investments and cross-border procurement. Today, with numerous platforms, new technologies and apps, we have 40 major public trading platforms in the global community that account for 90% of the trading volume of all online trading platforms.
Coming up next, how to design a new global governance mechanism, and how could the new mechanism affect your pocket? All these and more next on Closer to China. In the second decade of the 21st century, globalization both enjoyed a major advancement and suffered a major retrenchment. The major advancement was the Belt and Road Initiative, proposed and implemented by China. The major retrenchment was America First trade policies, instituted by U.S. President Donald Trump. As a contributor to and a beneficiary of economic globalization, how can China overcome difficulties and further open up? How can China ally with like-minded people around the world in trust and cooperation to promote a new round of economic globalization?
We want to promote and build fair relations of mutual benefit, innovation, and openness for the good of the people in Latin America in this era. Based on the respect and the will of the regional countries, China will explore trilateral and multilateral partnerships to make the pie bigger and produce more mutual benefits.
Compared with most Western countries, what is the difference in China's development focus in the new round of economic globalization?
China, as it's gaining confidence and economic strength, increasingly has moved outwards in its own way, with its own kind of agreements, its own kind of approach. And China's approach is very different. In particular, for example, it's more and more focused on its relations with the developing world. I mean, Africa was an early, probably the pioneer example of this, the Sino-African relationship, but especially in the recent period, the development of Belt and Road and so on. And I think that in that sense, Chinese globalization has become very distinctive. The primary axis is the relationship with the developing world, and it sees itself as playing the role of assisting the modernization of these countries.
Globalization should involve each and every country, but some Western countries, notably the U.S., are retreating from global cooperation and global governance. Can this trend be reversed to sustain and advance globalization? What can China do to make up for the withdrawal of certain countries?
There will continue to be a political backlash against globalization in the United States, in Europe. But this is something that the rest of the world cannot solve. This is the problem that has to be solved by the American people, right? And this is something, but what the rest of the world can do, for example, as you know, the United States is walking away from free trade agreements, right? It walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So when the United States walks away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, China should walk forwards with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. So we don't demonstrate our commitment towards globalization through just words. We demonstrate our commitment to globalization through our deeds.
The Belt and Road Initiative also is an important pillar of China's foreign trade and economic globalization. What has China actually achieved thus far?
The Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, proposed by China in 2013, has become a path for international cooperation and cross-border economic plans. As the initiator, China has signed BRI cooperation agreements with 136 countries and 30 international organizations. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank has seen its members rising from 57 to 97. Over the past 6 years, the BRI has seen the fastest of its growth rate in trading and investment, with technologies trading at 30% and investment at 60%.
Long before the Belt and Road Initiative was announced in 2013, many countries have benefited from China's engagement. Even so, some Western countries are still questioning China's real motives of this initiative. Some assume that China will seek regional hegemony. How do you view this idea? Looking into the Belt and Road Initiative, what is the
The
real core value that China is pursuing?
The core value of the Belt and Road Initiative is to build a community for the shared future for mankind. A thread running through it is connectivity, by which the whole world gets connected rather than decoupled. Many global problems are a result of a lack of connections, insufficient people-to-people ties, uncoordinated policies, unconnected infrastructure, or impeded trade without sufficient facilitation and liberalization. The BRI and the new Sustainable Development Agenda of the UN share the same grand goal of providing public goods to the international community. The steam engine was invented in the UK and it benefited the whole world. It promoted the Industrial Revolution and turned into a public technology. Electricity was invented in the UK. Electricity was invented in the US, but does that mean that only the US can use electricity? If electricity cannot be applied worldwide, it is not beneficial. So it lit up the whole world. The BRI was proposed by China, but that doesn't mean that it is China's own business. China will not run the whole show, nor export debt to any other country. Many participants of the BRI are underdeveloped countries. No other country had offered such tangible development opportunities to those countries by building industrial parks, railways, highways and bridges. They see the tangible benefits and are motivated to join the BRI. It is unstoppable by any force.
And actually Bulgaria gives a lot of examples how the Belt and Road Initiative works. For example, we are now having a lot of investments from China into the agricultural sector. On the other side, in China, there are 2 new modern factories under construction that are going to produce the very famous and healthy Bulgarian yogurt. On the other side, we have Chinese company that is participating on the final stage of our competition for a nuclear power station in Bulgaria, which is a huge strategic project for us. On the other side, we have companies like Haier or Huawei or Great Wall that are doing a very serious business in Bulgaria. And the Belt and Road Initiative is giving them more security and a better platform to expand. If you look at the neighboring countries, now China is building a high-speed rail in Serbia, is building a new great bridge in Croatia, has expanded its activities on the ports of Greece, and that is all contributing to a better jobs and a more trade and a more business to all the countries.
In terms of international cooperation, China has opened the door wide and actively provided the world with public goods like the Belt and Road Initiative. But with respect to domestic development, what new policies should China pursue to further reform and opening up?
Today, China's per capita GDP is less than $10,000 US. There is a long way to go. Therefore, we will pursue a quality economic growth after fulfilling the mission of extensive economic growth. Going forward will be an uphill task. After 40 years of reform and opening up, we have found a mechanism for creating wealth, but we have not yet found the mechanism for protecting wealth and need to consider new strategies about that.
Some countries believe that China is already a strong power, but we are aware of the huge gap between China and the US, the European countries and Japan in terms of high-end technology, education, creativity, basic research, etc.
How to protect or keep wealth? How to make high-quality capital, technology, and talent stay is a new problem, and it's a challenge facing China under the new round of economic globalization. How should China understand this issue, and how can it be addressed?
The reason why America has become the most innovative economy in the world is because it doesn't just use the brains of 330 million people in America. It uses the best brains from 7.5 billion people in the world. So if you go to Silicon Valley, most of the startups are not started by white Americans. They're started by immigrant Chinese. They're started by immigrant Indians and immigrant Europeans. So if China's universities can open their doors to the best brains from 7.5 billion people and try to build up the same ecosystem, then I think China can also become as competitive as America. It's all about the quality of brain power.
First, I think China should unswervingly build our manufacturing industries bigger and stronger and not allow them to be hollowed out. Second, do not transform too fast, or, in other words, prolong the boom cycle of the manufacturing industries. Third, we must unswervingly elevate the manufacturing value chain. Do not give up under pressure. Without breakthroughs in core technologies, we will be vulnerable to technological blockage.
For some of these high-end or even mid to high-end manufacturing industries, pressures are exerted globally, aiming to hinder development. Despite that, what incentives are offered by the Chinese government to ease or even dispel the pressure on manufacturing industries?
I think governments at all levels in China have taken measures. Generally speaking, it is to form a unified institutional design. For example, we are creating the best policy environment for the outstanding talents. Take Shenzhen, for example. It lowered individual income tax for outstanding talents living in Shenzhen from 45% to 15%, while the local government covers the rest 30% of their income tax. Thus, individual income tax in Shenzhen virtually matches that in Hong Kong, creating conditions to keep the top notch. Second, we should learn from the West by turning governmental hard subsidies into soft support. Hard subsidies give funds directly to enterprises, which then show clearly on financial statements. China will cancel all such subsidies and convert them into state public procurement. That means the contracts go indiscriminately to the successful bidder without regard to enterprise ownership. It offers equal national treatment for all, and state-owned enterprises will compete on a level playing field. The problem lies in how to implement such a reform.
In a stunning historic reversal, China transformed from being closed to the outside and suspicious of foreigners into being a champion of open globalization and embracing foreigners. The holding of expos, conferences, forums, fairs, and workshops highlights China's determination to engage more actively with the world. Across the country, almost every day, there are multiple international events. For example, in recent weeks, the Qingdao Multinational Summit, the World Internet Conference, the World Laureates Forum featuring 44 Nobel Prize winners, and the Forum on Chinese Civilization and China's Path. Although the U.S. and Europe are pushing China for wider access to domestic markets, it would be a mistake to assume that China is opening up further because of foreign pressure. China is opening up further because that is what is best for China, as attested by almost all Chinese economists. Indeed, China's leaders have long believed that the reason why China declined so precipitously in the 19th century, after leading the world economically and scientifically for a millennium, was that the country closed itself off from the outside world. China's leaders are determined not to make the same mistake again. The new round of globalization should be driven not only by the comparative advantage of low-cost production, but also by high technology, the internet, and diverse markets. As the new leader promoting globalization, China must keep attuned to the sensitivities of smaller countries with respect to local industry, employment, debt, and dignity. By continuing to open up, China is pursuing its own interests, and the world is encouraged to participate in the unprecedented opportunity. That's closer to China.